In a long-forgotten film from the 1930s, a group of archaeologists carefully brush away the soil from a human skeleton emerging from the limestone of Mount Carmel in the former British Mandate. The discovery began in 1931 when excavations at Skhul cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel uncovered one of the richest collections of ancient human skeletons ever found. Working under the direction of Dorothy Garrod, archaeologists recovered multiple individuals buried intentionally inside the cave. Among them, Skhul 5 immediately stood apart because of its exceptional preservation and unusual anatomy. The grainy motion picture captured the excavation itself, preserving one of the earliest moving images of a major paleoanthropological discovery. Watching that film today feels almost surreal, because the scientists carefully exposing the skeleton had no knowledge of ancient DNA, genome sequencing, or population genetics. Everything they concluded came entirely from the bones. The fossil is extraordinary. Even before it has fully emerged from the cave floor, those gathered around it realize they are looking at something that refuses to fit neatly into any existing category. The face appears remarkably modern, yet the brow is massive. The forehead rises higher than a Neanderthal, yet not quite like a recent human. The skull seems to belong to two different worlds at once. Today we know this individual as Skhul 5, one of the most famous early members of Homo sapiens ever discovered. Yet almost nobody remembers that when this skeleton first entered the scientific world, one explanation immediately stood above the others. These early humans were widely believed to represent a mixture between modern humans and Neanderthals. That conclusion feels surprisingly modern because it sounds remarkably similar to what genetics now tells us. Yet the story of Skhul is not simply the discovery of an ancient skeleton. It is also the story of how an entire scientific interpretation rose to prominence, disappeared for nearly half a century, and has now quietly returned. The remarkable twist is that one of the leading figures responsible for dismissing the original interpretation has recently acknowledged that the central idea behind it deserves serious consideration once again. The anatomy created an immediate puzzle. Skhul 5 possessed a high rounded brain case, characteristic of Homo sapiens, yet it also carried an exceptionally prominent brow ridge that rivaled many classic Neanderthals. The face projected farther than recent people, the jaw was robust. The skeleton itself was powerfully built. None of these characteristics fit comfortably within the existing definitions of either modern humans or Neanderthals. Instead, the fossil appeared to combine characteristics from both. We now come to one of the most important and surprising specimens found in the Skhul cave. Skhul 9 was a powerfully built adult male, but what makes him extraordinary is not simply his size. It is the unmistakable evidence that he died from what appears to have been a devastating spear attack. As the skeleton was carefully excavated, researchers noticed an unusual brown cavity running through the head of the left femur and deep into the hip socket. When the surrounding matrix was removed, it became clear they were looking at one of the oldest and most dramatic examples of interpersonal violence ever discovered in the prehistoric record. The weapon struck from behind, entering through the left buttock while the man's body was crouched or lying on its side with the thigh tightly flexed against the abdomen. Because the hip was bent, the spear passed directly through the gluteal muscles, pierced the hip joint itself, shattered the head of the femur, broke through the floor of the acetabulum, and continued more than 2 inches into the pelvic cavity. The shape of the wound is remarkably regular, almost rectangular in cross-section, allowing the excavators to produce a cast of the cavity and reconstruct the dimensions of the weapon that made it. The investigators concluded that the point of the weapon must have remained lodged inside the body after the attack. Had it been made of stone or bone, it would almost certainly have survived. Instead, nothing remained except the empty cavity, leading them to infer that the spear had a hardened wooden point that decayed over thousands of years. The penetration was so deep that the point likely projected an inch or more into the pelvic basin after passing through solid bone. The researchers also noticed damage near the back of the pelvis that may represent the mark of an earlier thrust before the fatal blow entered the hip joint. Whether that interpretation is correct or not, they regarded the hip wound itself as unequivocal evidence of a spear attack inflicted at or very near the time of death. In their view, it demonstrated that the people of the Mousterian period possessed powerful thrusting spears capable of driving through muscle and solid bone with tremendous force. Adding to the mystery, the same individual also bore a massive hole in the left side of his skull. The original investigators suggested this may have been another weapon injury delivered around the time of death, although they admitted the evidence for the skull wound was less certain than for the hip. The hip injury, however, left little room for doubt. It stands as one of the clearest examples of lethal violence preserved in the fossil record and provides rare, direct evidence that these early humans were capable not only of making sophisticated wooden spears, but of using them with deadly effectiveness. At almost exactly the same time, nearby Kafsa Cave yielded another remarkable collection of early Homo sapiens. Together, the Skhul and Kafsa skeletons formed what became known as the Skhul-Kafsa population, dating to roughly 120,000 years ago. These individuals occupied the Levant during an unusually warm climatic interval when both African and European populations expanded beyond their usual territories. Geography alone created an obvious possibility. This narrow corridor connected 3 continents. If 2 human populations were ever going to encounter each other, this was the place. Several leading scholars embraced precisely that conclusion. They argued that the Skhul skeletons represented hybrids between incoming Homo sapiens and local Neanderthals. This interpretation did not arise from speculation alone. It emerged because the anatomy genuinely appeared intermediate. The fossils simply refused to behave like members of separate, isolated species. Instead, they formed a continuum of characteristics. That interpretation fits surprisingly well with how many anthropologists viewed human evolution during the middle decades of the 20th century. Rather than seeing every ancient population as a completely separate species, many regarded Neanderthals as regional members of a much broader human family. From the 1960s through much of the 1980s, classifying Neanderthals as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis remained a common scientific practice. Under this arrangement, Neanderthals were understood as a geographical branch of our own species rather than an entirely different human. Within that framework, the Skhul discoveries made perfect sense. If Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens belonged to the same species, then populations meeting in the Levant would naturally exchange genes. The unusual combination of characteristics seen at Skhul required no extraordinary explanation. It represented exactly what one would expect whenever neighbouring populations interbred over many generations. Then, the scientific picture changed dramatically. During the 1980s, a growing number of researchers began arguing that Neanderthals deserved full species status. Among the strongest advocates was Chris Stringer. His work emphasized anatomical differences separating Neanderthals from recent humans and became closely associated with the growing out of Africa model. Within this emerging framework, Homo sapiens evolved relatively recently in Africa before replacing other human populations across Eurasia. Neanderthals became Homo neanderthalensis, a distinct species standing beside rather than within modern humanity. That shift fundamentally changed how Skhul was interpreted. Once Neanderthals became a separate species, hybridization became increasingly difficult to accommodate. Intermediate anatomy no longer pointed naturally toward mixed ancestry. Instead, researchers searched for alternative explanations. Some characteristics were described as primitive features retained from earlier ancestors. Others became examples of ordinary variation within early Homo sapiens. The hybrid interpretation gradually faded from mainstream discussion. Over time, many younger researchers entered the field, knowing only this revised picture. Skhul became celebrated as one of the earliest examples of anatomically modern humans outside Africa, rather than as evidence of interaction between neighbouring human populations. The remarkable history surrounding its original interpretation slowly disappeared into old journals, forgotten conference proceedings, and archived films. Then, Genetics transformed everything. When the first Neanderthal genome became available, one of the greatest assumptions in paleoanthropology collapsed almost overnight. Modern people living outside Africa consistently carried inherited Neanderthal DNA. Later work demonstrated that Denisovan ancestry also persisted across large parts of Asia and Oceania. These findings established something that earlier generations had debated without decisive evidence. Ancient human populations repeatedly exchanged genes. The significance extended far beyond a single episode of contact. Subsequent discoveries revealed multiple episodes of interbreeding occurring at different places and different times. Genetic studies uncovered evidence that early Homo sapiens entered Eurasia several times. Neanderthals themselves received genetic contributions from earlier modern human populations. Denisovans interbred with Neanderthals. Different Denisovan populations exchanged genes among themselves. Human evolution increasingly resembled an interconnected network rather than a sequence of isolated branches. The older image of completely separate human species became increasingly difficult to defend without important qualifications. Gene flow was not a rare accident occurring only once. It appeared repeatedly across hundreds of thousands of years. This growing body of evidence gradually influenced even researchers who had originally championed strict species separation. Chris Stringer himself has openly acknowledged that hybridization played a much larger role than previously believed. In a recent video discussing the implications of ancient DNA, the host stated that hybridization was essentially the norm throughout human evolution, rather than an exceptional event. Even more strikingly, the host explained that viewing Neanderthals and Denisovans as populations within Homo sapiens remains a scientifically valid interpretation. He emphasized that both perspectives continue to exist within current scientific discussion. Those remarks represent a remarkable reversal when viewed against the intellectual history of the subject. The scientist who helped popularize Neanderthals as a completely separate species now accepts that classifying them within Homo sapiens remains a legitimate scientific position. The implications extend far beyond terminology because they return attention to fossils such as Skhul in an entirely different light. Suddenly, the original interpretation proposed during the 1930s no longer appears outdated. Instead, it aligns remarkably well with what ancient genomes have revealed. The archaeologists who uncovered Skhul 5 possessed none of the molecular evidence available today, yet they recognized, simply from studying the skeleton, that they were looking at a population combining characteristics usually assigned to different groups. Their conclusion turned out to anticipate discoveries that arrived almost 80 years later. Even the geography strengthens this picture. The Levant repeatedly served as a crossroads connecting Africa and Eurasia throughout the Ice Age. Climatic fluctuations periodically transformed the region into a corridor supporting abundant vegetation, large mammals, and expanding human populations. Whenever environmental conditions improved, groups from different directions occupied the same landscapes. Encounters became inevitable. Other discoveries reinforced this pattern. The nearby caves of Tabun, Kebara, and Amud preserve unmistakable Neanderthals. Kafse contains unmistakable early Homo sapiens. Skhul occupies a fascinating position between these categories, combining anatomical characteristics that originally inspired the hybrid interpretation. Rather than representing isolated evolutionary experiments, these cave systems preserve neighboring populations sharing the same landscape over thousands of years. Ancient DNA also demonstrates that interbreeding rarely produced neat boundaries. Every generation blurred distinctions slightly further. Physical characteristics shifted gradually across space and time rather than changing abruptly at invisible species borders. Once this perspective is accepted, fossils displaying mixed anatomy become expected rather than surprising. That realization also encourages a broader question. How many other fossils were originally described as intermediate before later interpretations forced them into more rigid categories? Throughout paleoanthropology, specimens often resist simple classification because evolution itself seldom follows simple rules. Nature produces variation, overlap, and gradual transitions. Human attempts to organize those patterns into clear boxes sometimes succeed. Yet sometimes those boxes obscure the very relationships the fossils reveal. None of this eliminates genuine anatomical differences between Neanderthals and recent humans. Neanderthals possessed distinctive characteristics shaped through hundreds of thousands of years living across Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. Their bodies became adapted to cold environments. Their skulls developed recognizable proportions. Their faces projected farther forward than recent humans. Those characteristics remain real. The question concerns whether those differences represent separate species or deeply divergent populations capable of continual gene exchange. Genetics increasingly favors the second possibility because successful interbreeding occurred often enough to leave permanent signatures throughout living human genomes. Every person carrying inherited Neanderthal DNA preserves evidence that these ancient populations never became completely isolated from one another. That does not settle the debate completely. Species definitions remain surprisingly flexible, particularly when discussing extinct humans. Some researchers continue preferring separate species because Neanderthals maintain distinctive anatomical characteristics across immense stretches of time. Others emphasize reproductive compatibility and widespread gene exchange, placing them within Homo sapiens. Both interpretations continue receiving serious scientific discussion. What has undeniably changed is the confidence surrounding older assumptions. The simple picture of modern humans replacing entirely separate species has become far more complicated. Human evolution now resembles a braided stream, with populations dividing, reconnecting, exchanging genes, separating again, and repeatedly influencing one another across hundreds of thousands of years. Seen through that lens, the old film from Skhul acquires an entirely new significance. Those black and white images capture more than an archaeological excavation. They preserved the beginning of an idea that disappeared before returning with unexpected force many decades later. The scientists kneeling beside Skhul 5 believed they had uncovered evidence that different human populations once met and blended together. Their conclusion gradually disappeared as scientific fashions shifted. Then genetics quietly brought the same possibility back into the center of the conversation. Science often advances by replacing older ideas with better ones. Yet every so often, an older interpretation returns because new evidence reveals that the original investigators noticed something genuinely important. Skhul appears to belong to exactly that kind of story. The fossil never changed. Only our understanding of what those remarkable bones were trying to tell us changed. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside this forgotten excavation. Scientific knowledge does not move in a perfectly straight line. Ideas rise, disappear, and sometimes return with greater strength than before because entirely new evidence transforms how old discoveries are understood. The archaeologists working at Skhul during the 1930s could never imagine genome sequencing or ancient DNA laboratories. Yet their careful observations anticipated one of the most important discoveries in the history of human evolution. Sometimes the oldest clues become the newest discoveries, reminding us that the answers were sitting quietly beneath the dust all along, waiting for science to catch up. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy exploring the forgotten discoveries, overlooked evidence, and fascinating debates surrounding our ancient past, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next investigation. Human origins remain one of the greatest scientific puzzles ever explored, and every new discovery has the power to reshape ideas that once seemed settled. Until next time, thank you for spending your time with me.